There are towns in America with no grocery store, no gas station, no stoplight, and barely 200 residents. But they have a courthouse, a full-column, marble-faced, pediment-top courthouse that looks like it belongs in ancient Rome. Nobody built that, nobody questions it, nobody asks who paid for it or why it looks like that. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Drive through the rural American Midwest on any two-lane highway and you will find them everywhere. A cluster of grain silos, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a hardware store that has been there since 1952, and then, rising from the flat earth like a hallucination, a courthouse with Corinthian columns, a bronze dome, carved stone medallions, and a set of steps so wide and grand that they would look more at home in Washington, D.C. than in a county seat, where the last contested election involved exactly 412 votes. These buildings are not accidents. They are not local expressions of civic pride paid for by bake sales and timber sales. They are the physical footprint of a system of finance, labor, and political economy that operated at a scale most Americans have never been taught to understand. And the reason nobody asks who really built them is because the answer, when you follow it all the way back, says something uncomfortable about how the American state was actually constructed. Start with the numbers. Between roughly 1880 and 1930, the United States built thousands of county courthouses, federal post offices, city halls, and customs houses. Many of them were in communities so small that the populations today have not grown since the buildings were completed. Woodbury County, Iowa, Lincoln County, New Mexico, Concordia Parish, Louisiana. These are not major urban centers. They are places where the largest single employer for most of the 20th century was the county government itself. And yet each of them has a building that required architects, quarried stone, trained masons, ironworkers, and in many cases decorative programs involving sculptors and muralists brought in from Philadelphia or Chicago or New York. Where did the money come from? The standard answer you will find in a county history pamphlet, if you can find one at all, is that the building was paid for by a bond issue passed by the county commission, local pride, local investment, a community that believed in itself. This answer is not wrong. It is just radically incomplete. The bond markets that financed American public construction in the Gilded Age and Progressive era were not local at all. They were controlled by a handful of investment houses concentrated almost entirely in a few blocks of Lower Manhattan, and before the Civil War, in London. Firms like J.P., Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb, and the First National Bank underwrote the debt instruments that allowed counties with no tax base to speak of to commission buildings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A county assessor in rural Nebraska did not wake up one morning and decide he could afford marble. He signed a note that was then packaged, sold, and distributed to investors in Boston and Baltimore who had never seen the county and had no intention of ever visiting it. This is the first invisible layer of construction. The building looks like an expression of local ambition. The financial structure underneath it is a product of concentrated capital operating at a national scale. But the money is only part of the story. Ask who designed these buildings and you run into the second invisible layer. Alfred Mullett, who served as supervising architect of the Treasury from 1866 to 1874, designed buildings in Portland, Oregon, and New York City and St. Louis that share more visual language with each other than with anything in the communities where they sit. James Knox Taylor, who held the same position from 1897 to 1912, oversaw the construction of hundreds of post offices across the country that look as though they were stamped from the same mold, because functionally they were. The designs were adapted from standard plans. Local contractors bid on the work. Materials were sometimes shipped across the continent by rail because the government had supply contracts with specific quarries. The communities that received these buildings had almost no input into what they looked like. They received a building that looked like a Roman temple because the federal government had decided that Roman temples were what serious republics were built in. The decision was made in Washington. The aesthetics were determined by trained architects working in a professional culture shaped by the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The local county seat was simply the address. Follow the land titles and you begin to understand what the courthouse was actually there to do. The great land booms of the American interior in the second half of the 19th century required an administrative system that could process, record, and legally defend millions of individual land transactions. Homesteaders needed deeds, railroad companies needed right-of-way registrations, timber interests needed patent filings, mining companies needed claim records. None of this was possible without a county courthouse with a recorder of deeds office that was open 5 days a week and staffed by clerks who knew how to process the paperwork. The Federal Homestead Act of 1862 is usually told as a story of free land for ordinary Americans, and at the level of the individual family it was. But at the level of the system it was a mechanism for creating millions of legally defensible individual property rights that could then be borrowed against, sold, subdivided, taxed, and incorporated into a national credit economy. The courthouse made those property rights real. Without a place to record the deed and have it witnessed and filed and made part of the public record, the land grant was just a piece of paper. The courthouse transformed it into collateral, and collateral in the economy of the Gilded Age was what the whole system ran on. Banks lent against land. Land values depended on legal title. Legal title depended on county records. County records depended on clerks and judges, and a physical building that could house and protect the records. If you wanted to extend credit into the American interior, you needed courthouses. This is why railroad companies sometimes lobbied actively for the creation of new counties in territories they were developing. A new county meant a new courthouse. A new courthouse meant a functioning land title system. A functioning land title system meant that the land along the railroad's route had bankable value. The courthouse was infrastructure for credit, just as surely as the tracks were infrastructure for freight. The architecture was not incidental to this function. It was essential to it. There is a reason these buildings look like Roman temples and not like barns. The Roman temple form, transmitted through Renaissance Italy and then through the Beaux-Arts tradition, carried a specific set of associations: permanence, authority, the rule of law as something eternal and transcendent, not contingent and political. A courthouse that looks like it has always been there and will always be there is a courthouse that makes the property arrangements it administers look equally permanent. The farmer who records his deed in a building with Corinthian columns and a carved frieze is being told, without words, that his title is backed by something older than any particular government, that the law which protects his ownership is as solid as stone and as timeless as Rome. This was not an accident of aesthetic taste. It was a technology of legitimacy. The people who designed these buildings understood what they were doing. Montgomery Meigs, the Army Quartermaster General who oversaw much of the physical construction of the federal government in the mid-19th century, was explicit in his diaries about the relationship between architectural form and political authority. The architect, William Aiken, working in South Carolina before the Civil War, designed courthouses that were meant to embody the permanence of planter-class property from rights at a moment when those rights were under political pressure. After the Civil War, Reconstruction-era courthouses in the South were sometimes deliberately redesigned or replaced to signal a change in who the law was meant to serve, before many of them were redesigned again after Reconstruction ended. The building changes when the political economy changes, or the political economy changes the building. There is a version of this story that is purely about the federal government and large capital, but some of the most revealing cases involve local booster culture and how ordinary people were recruited into this system. County seat wars, the often bitter and sometimes violent competitions between small towns to become the administrative centre of a newly organised county, were a feature of the Great Plains from the 1870s through the 1890s. Towns competed for the courthouse because the courthouse was the economic engine of the county seat. It brought lawyers, which brought money. It brought the Land Records Office, which brought the people who needed land transactions processed. It brought the probate court, which administered estates, which meant that when anyone in the county died with property, that property moved through the county seat before it moved anywhere else. Saloons, hotels, law offices, printing shops, and dry goods stores clustered around courthouses because that was where the money and the people were. Towns that lost the county seat often declined and sometimes disappeared. Towns that won it survived. The courthouse was not merely a symbol of civic status. It was a direct economic subsidy delivered in the form of architectural grandeur and administrative function. When a county commission borrowed money to build a courthouse that was larger and more impressive than any practical need required, they were not being extravagant. They were competing. They were signalling to potential settlers, to potential investors, to the railroad companies that were deciding where to lay track, that this town was serious, that this town had credit, that this town had a functioning legal infrastructure that could support commerce and property and debt. The column was a marketing tool. Think about what that means for the towns that won the competition and then declined anyway. There are county seats across the Great Plains and the rural South and the old mining West, where the courthouse is now the largest building in town by a factor of 5, where the marble floors are maintained by a staff of 3 people, where the docket has maybe 20 cases a month, where the building costs more to heat and cool and repair than the county's entire discretionary budget. These buildings were not built for the communities they now serve. They were built for the communities that the boosters and the railroad companies and the land speculators and the investment banks expected those communities to become. They were built for a future that never arrived, or arrived and left, and the buildings remain as the physical residue of someone else's financial calculations. The people who live in those towns today did not inherit a gift. They inherited a liability with a beautiful facade. The Roman temple form was not chosen because American architects were nostalgic for antiquity. It was chosen because it communicated in a visual language that any literate person in the 19th century could read, that the institutions housed inside these buildings were as legitimate and as enduring as the institutions of Rome. The Senate, the courts, the treasury, the laws that govern the ownership of property and the enforcement of contracts. All of it dressed in the architectural vocabulary of civilization itself. What nobody tells you when they write the plaque for the courthouse lawn, the one that lists the construction date and the architect's name, and thanks the Daughters of the American Revolution for the restoration project, is that the building was also a claim made in stone and mortar on behalf of a specific set of economic interests, about how land would be owned, how resources would be extracted, how debt would be enforced, and who would profit from all of it. The town did not build the courthouse built the town, in the image and to the specifications of people who were never going to live there. That is what the columns are really saying, not that the law is eternal and just, that someone with capital decided it was worth investing in the appearance of the law being eternal and just, and that investment, like most investments in American history, generated returns for people other than the ones who lived closest to it. The next time you drive through a town of 200 people and see a courthouse that looks like it belongs in Rome, do not wonder how they built it. Wonder who needed it built. Wonder what they were getting out of it. Wonder what happened when they got it. And wonder whether the building you are looking at is a monument to civic pride, or a very beautiful, very expensive, very permanent receipt. And that is the real story behind those Roman temple courthouses in towns that barely have a stoplight. They were not built by communities. They were built by capital, debt markets, land speculators, and railroad companies who needed the law to look eternal. The towns were the address. The architecture was the advertisement. And the people living under those columns are still paying for it today. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.